In May of 2025, a stunning announcement emerged from Jakarta. Officials in the government of Indonesia revealed a plan to dramatically change the flow of energy across Southeast Asia. They would scale back fuel purchases from their neighbor, Singapore. For decades, Singapore has been the main source of refined petroleum for Indonesia, a vital lifeline for a growing economy. Now, that lifeline was being deliberately frayed. The Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources, Bahlil Lahadalia, spoke directly to reporters on May 9. He declared that Indonesia could redirect a massive portion of its fuel imports away from Singapore. The number he gave was as much as 60%. He said this shift could happen within the next 6 months. The cuts would not happen all at once, they would be phased in gradually. But the message itself was anything but gradual. The intent was sharp and clear. Minister Bahlil Lahadalia stated, "It is almost certain that we will take other fuel imports from other countries. Not from that one." He was, of course, referring to Singapore. He did not stop there. He suggested that the ultimate goal for Indonesia was even more ambitious. The country, he said, aims to reduce imports from Singapore down to zero, someday. This policy shift came as a surprise to many observers. It signaled a fundamental break in a long-standing economic relationship. To understand why Indonesia would make such a bold and disruptive move, you have to look at two powerful motivations. The first is a deep-seated frustration over money and respect. The second is a complex dance of global geopolitics, involving a high-stakes negotiation with the United States. The first reason for this major pivot is rooted in a feeling of economic unfairness. Minister Bahlil Lahadalia did not hide his dissatisfaction with the prices Indonesia was paying. He openly criticized what he called a shameful strategy from Singapore. He argued that Singapore was charging Indonesia the same prices for fuel as it charged to buyers from far away, like those in the Middle East. He pointed to a great irony in the situation. He noted that Singapore does not have its own oil reserves. It produces no crude oil from its own land. And yet, Indonesia, a massive and neighboring country, was buying huge volumes of fuel from there. Despite the extremely close proximity of Singapore, buyers in Indonesia were receiving no discount for being next door. They paid the same international market rates as a customer an ocean away. This lack of a geographic advantage in pricing clearly irritated officials in Jakarta. The statistics paint a clear picture of this dynamic. Of all the fuel produced and traded out of the hub in Singapore, 34% of the market is Indonesia. Despite being such a significant customer, Indonesia saw no price benefit. Minister Bahlil Lahadalia expressed this frustration in stark terms. He remarked, "The price is the same as the Middle East. I say this is a shameful strategy." His words reveal a sense that Indonesia, as a close and large customer, was not being valued. This complaint about pricing became a key justification for the decision from Jakarta. It set the stage for a search for new suppliers, ones that might offer better terms or greater strategic advantages for Indonesia. The second major motivation for this policy change is connected to a tense negotiation with the United States. The government of the United States, under President Donald Trump, alleged that Indonesia, along with several other Southeast Asian nations, was helping China bypass U.S. tariffs by acting as a transshipment hub. Rerouting Chinese goods through its ports to disguise their origin, they had threatened to impose steep tariffs on goods from Indonesia. The proposed tariff rate was 32%. This was a punitive measure, a reaction to the sizable trade surplus that Indonesia holds with the United States. In simple terms, Indonesia was selling far more goods to the United States than it was buying from them. The implementation of these damaging tariffs was not immediate. The action was paused until July of 2025. This pause created a window for negotiation. To avoid the heavy economic blow of a 32% tariff, the government of Indonesia began looking for ways to appease Washington. It needed to find a way to balance the trade relationship. One powerful proposal emerged from these discussions. Indonesia offered to dramatically increase its imports of energy from the United States. The proposed increase was a staggering $10 billion. By purchasing more products from America, Indonesia hoped to address the concerns in the United States about the trade imbalance. These products would include crude oil, refined fuels like gasoline and diesel, and liquefied petroleum gas. This context is essential to understanding the full picture. The plan from Indonesia is not simply to stop buying from Singapore and purchase fuel from any other country. It is a highly specific plan. It involves shifting a very large portion of those purchases directly to suppliers in the United States. This move is intended as a goodwill gesture, a strategic concession in the high-stakes tariff talks. Minister Bahlil Lahadalia confirmed this link himself. He stated that increasing fuel imports from the United States is part of a wider proposal that Indonesia has made to Washington. It is a tool to try and stave off the 32% tariffs. The scale of this proposed shift is enormous. He noted that Indonesia could boost its imports of crude oil from the United States to 10 times the current volume. To be clear, the current volume is very small. At the time of the announcement, only about 4% of the crude oil imports for Indonesia came from the United States. The plan would transform this small stream of trade into a major river. The same is true for refined fuels. In 2024, the amount of refined fuels like gasoline that Indonesia imported from the United States was negligible. It was less than 0.1%. Under the new plan, fuels made in the United States would suddenly make up a much larger share of all the fuel imports for Indonesia. This shows the pivot away from Singapore is not just about finding a cheaper seller. It is a calculated move on the global chessboard, designed to secure a better economic future with a powerful trading partner. The decision by Indonesia to untangle itself from Singapore raises a fundamental question. How did Indonesia, a major oil-producing nation in its own right, become so dependent on its tiny neighbor for fuel? Minister Bahlil Lahadalia himself observed the strange nature of the situation. He said, "Our fuel supply is coming from a country that doesn't even produce oil." The reasons for this dependency are not simple. They are rooted in decades of separate economic histories and different energy policies in the two nations. The story begins with Singapore. Despite having no domestic crude oil, the leaders of Singapore made a brilliant strategic decision decades ago. Starting in the 1960s and 1970s, they invested heavily in building a massive refining and distribution industry. They capitalized on the perfect geographic location of their nation, which sits directly on the world's most important shipping routes. They combined this location with a business-friendly environment that attracted international investment. The model was straightforward but powerful. Singapore would import raw crude oil from major producers around the world, from the Middle East to other parts of Southeast Asia. Its massive refineries would then process this crude oil. They would turn it into high-value finished products like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Singapore then exported these fuels across the entire Asia-Pacific region. Over many years, this strategy worked incredibly well. Singapore transformed itself into one of the top 3 oil trading and refining hubs in the world. Its total refining capacity stands at about 1.3 to 1.5 million barrels per day. To put that in perspective, 1 barrel is roughly 159 liters. So, 1.5 million barrels means that the refineries in Singapore can process about 238 million liters of oil every single day. While Singapore was building this refining empire, Indonesia was on a different path. The country has struggled for years to expand its own domestic oil production and its own refining capacity. At the same time, the population and the economy of Indonesia were growing rapidly. This growth created a surging demand for fuel. Soon, the fuel demand of the nation far outstripped what the local refineries in Indonesia could supply. This imbalance forced the country to look elsewhere. It had to import large quantities of refined fuel simply to keep its cars, trucks, and industries running. In this situation, buying from Singapore was the most logical choice. Geographically and economically, it just made sense. Singapore is right next door. Just a short trip across the Strait of Malacca. It had an ample supply of any fuel that Indonesia needed, ready to ship at a moment's notice. There were also well-established trade and shipping links between the two countries, which made the transactions smooth and efficient. Importers in Indonesia could purchase fuel from Singapore and have it delivered by tanker ships in a matter of days. This was much faster and more reliable than waiting for long-haul shipments from the Middle East or even further away. Furthermore, While the prices from Singapore were based on the international market, they were competitive. This was due to the incredible efficiency and the high-volume operations of the hub in Singapore. There were also regional trade agreements and deep historical ties that helped to smooth the path for this commerce. As one analysis noted, purchasing oil from Singapore, rather than trying to buy it directly from producers in the Middle East, remained the most practical solution. This was because of the proximity, the existing trade agreements, and the sophisticated refinery infrastructure in Singapore. By the 2010s, this relationship had solidified. Singapore had become the dominant external supplier for all the fuel needs of Indonesia. For example, in the years from 2017 to 2022, Singapore was consistently ranked as the #1 source of refined fuel for Indonesia. This was a trend often noted by media in Indonesia. Even as Indonesia imported its own crude oil from countries like Saudi Arabia or Nigeria to feed its own refineries, it still had to rely on Singapore for the finished, ready-to-use petroleum products. In effect, Singapore was acting as a giant, outsourced refinery for all the consumers in Indonesia. The numbers show the true scale of this dependency. According to customs data from early 2025, Singapore supplied over 60% of all the imported gasoline used in Indonesia in the year 2024. In that year alone, Singapore shipped an average of 236.000 barrels of gasoline to Indonesia every single day. The next largest supplier of gasoline was Malaysia, but it was a distant second, exporting only about 79.500 barrels per day to Indonesia. The dominance of Singapore was undeniable. And it was not just gasoline. Singapore was also a major source of other critical fuels. In just the first 4 months of 2025, it exported an average of 54.000 barrels per day of diesel fuel and 8.300 barrels per day of jet fuel to Indonesia. These figures demonstrate a profound reliance. A significant portion of the trucks, cars, and airplanes across the vast archipelago of Indonesia were effectively running on fuel that was refined in Singapore. Making such a dramatic announcement is one thing. Putting the plan into action is another. The government of Indonesia has already taken concrete steps to prepare for this historic shift in its energy supply chain. The coordinating Minister for Maritime Affairs and Investment, Luhut Binsar Panjaitan, issued a directive in May of 2025. He gave a clear order to Pertamina, the state-owned energy company of Indonesia. The order was to halt fuel imports from Singapore and to begin sourcing fuel from other places. The executives at Pertamina have responded. They stated publicly that they will comply with the government directive. They are ready to adjust their supply chains to make this change happen. But this adjustment will be a major logistical challenge. The company will likely need to expand its storage capacity. This is because fuel shipped from more distant sources, like the United States, will require different handling. There is also talk of building new port facilities or upgrading existing ones. These ports will need to accommodate the larger, long-haul oil tankers that are used for transoceanic voyages. This infrastructure development is crucial. Bringing fuel all the way from the Gulf of Mexico or the Middle East is a very different process than the short-hop shipments from Singapore. Longer voyages will likely involve using much bigger ships to be economical. These ships are known as Very Large Crude Carriers, or VLCCs. To prepare for this, authorities in Indonesia have reportedly already begun constructing new docks. These new facilities are specifically designed to receive VLCCs and other large vessels. This shows a clear anticipation of the need for more direct imports from producers that are far away. Despite the bold announcements and the clear intentions, officials in Indonesia also acknowledge a practical reality. This transition will be gradual. It will be carefully managed. You cannot simply upend existing supply contracts overnight. To do so would risk creating serious domestic fuel shortages, which would be a political and economic disaster. Pertamina and other private importers in Indonesia typically secure their fuel through term contracts. These contracts are often settled on a free-on-board Singapore basis. This means the fuel is officially purchased at the port in Singapore, and the buyer then arranges for the shipping to Indonesia. These contracts are not day-to-day agreements. They often run for many months at a time. This is why, as of May 2025, traders in the region noted that it was still business as usual. No immediate cutoff of shipments from Singapore had actually occurred. The tankers were still sailing. The real change is expected to happen later, when Pertamina enters its next round of negotiations for import contracts, which will cover the second half of 2025. Things will be different. It is at this point that the company is expected to actively seek deals with suppliers in the United States or with refineries in the Middle East. These new deals will take the place of some of the volumes that were previously sourced from Singapore. In the early stages of this plan, Indonesia envisions shifting about 60% of the fuel it currently buys from Singapore. This volume will be moved over to the United States and possibly to other sources in the Middle East. This means Singapore would not be eliminated entirely as a supplier, at least not right away. However, its long-held dominance as the primary fuel source for Indonesia would be sharply and permanently reduced. Indonesia is moving to diversify its import mix, breaking a decades-long dependency in pursuit of new economic and political goals. This pivot marks a new chapter in the energy story of Southeast Asia, with consequences that will ripple across the entire region.